number of years ago. And Michael Flippin, who's down there, who mentioned that, is a professional cook. So he'll cook for us. Chef. I'm sorry. A sous chef. Is that the term?
It's like calling you a building inspector.
Okay. I'm sorry.
You're an engineer, my friend.
Okay. All right. Well, it is 9:30, and I would say that this was, hopefully other people will join because they're joining pretty quickly. But I'm kind of a firm believer that if we say we're starting at 9:30, we start at 9:30, and this will be recorded if anybody would like to get a copy. But everybody has scheduled, so I'm actually going to start right now. It is 9:30, and I'm sure hopefully some people will join us because they're coming in. But like I said before, we've had close to 100 people who've signed up for today's webinar, and right now you can probably see if you look at the participants, we're at 40, but usually it's overbooked, but at least in the range of 100 people signed up. So to get started, my name is Mitch Frumkin. I know a lot of you, and I see that we have somebody here from Rockland, New York, somebody else here from Washington, D.C. So we have a pretty spread out audience today, which is great. And if you do find this interesting, and we even have a cat there behind Maureen sitting on her chair. But if you find this interesting, you want to share it, we're in the process of recording this also. Just to tell you a little bit about myself, my name's Mitch Frumkin. I'm president of Kipcon, which is an engineering consulting firm. We've been in business for a number of years. We inspect buildings all the time. We do a lot of reserve studies. I'm also past president of the New Jersey chapter of CAI, the Pennsylvania chapter of CAI, and I was national president of CAI a number of years ago. I was very involved in the development of the National Reserve Study Standards, which were just recently updated, which has become a very hot topic these days, which I'll talk about. And also headed up the development of the best practices paper on transition, which is used as the basis for the M370 class, which CAI offers nationwide. It's on managing developing communities. The other thing that you may be interested in is that CAI offers the M320 class, managing high-rise buildings. And I'm one of the instructors of that class. That class is actually, by coincidence, I guess, being offered, I think it's July 22nd and July 23rd of this year in the next few weeks. It's a 2-day class. If it's in person, it's actually 2 full days. This year, it's 6 hours. It's on a Thursday from 12 to 3 and on a Friday from 12 to 3. And the course, we actually had a Zoom conversation with all the speakers a few days ago, because based on what's recently happened and what's going on, clearly this has to be geared a little towards what I'm going to be talking about today. But you may want to consider participating in that class. The speakers include, there's an attorney who's going to be speaking. There's somebody who specializes in facade restorations, mechanical equipment. So there's a number of speakers. The way that class is set up is that a lot of information. It's 6 hours, 6 speakers, and a lot of information. So just if you're interested in that, go to the CAI website. So just to get going, I want to give you everybody can see the screen. First, a little background, I assume you can see that. And we're doing this as a Zoom today. I like the Zoom the way we're doing it, where I can see faces and you can see my face. So don't be shy about jumping in and asking questions. What we're talking about today is a work in progress. And I'll tell you why as I go through this, but feel free to put in chat messages, to jump in and talk, and please try to make this interactive. But just to give you a little background, as you can tell, I'm very involved in CAI National. When the tragedy in Florida happened, CAI put together a national, I'll call it a committee or task force. It's based on the National Government and Public Affairs group, put together all of their group, and they invited 3 people that are not on the group. They invited 2 engineers and 3 people who are the reserve specialist designation. Myself, who's also a licensed engineer, a gentleman, Bob Browning from California, who's an RS, a reserve specialist, but is not a licensed engineer, as well as Robert Nordland from California, who is a reserve specialist and also a licensed engineer. So they asked us to join this group. And we had a meeting. It was a Zoom meeting. There were about, I'll tell you how much I enjoyed it. There were 30 attorneys and 3 of us. And we spoke for at least an hour, going back and forth about what happened and what direction and what public policy and position CAI is going to take on this on a national level. So there are a lot of discussions about reserve studies, deferred maintenance, all the kind of stuff I'm going to talk about. So what has ultimately happened is that group has been split into a few different task forces. One of them has to do with, which I'll show you in a minute, has to do with inspections. The other has to do with reserve studies. And the other one has to do with risk management. The one that has to do with inspections on a national level, I'm one of the chairs of that committee, and I'm also on the one dealing with reserve studies. And then, so that's the kind of stuff that's going on in the background. On a local level, you can see that there's a gentleman sitting here. His name is Ed San George. Ed San George is president of Integra Management, and Ed has been asked on New Jersey to head up a task force very similar to what we're doing on a national level in regards to this. And I don't know, Ed, if you want to take a second to explain what your task force is doing, because Ed has asked me to be part of that task force also. But Ed, please jump in.
Okay, well, thank you, Mitch. Good morning, everybody. I'm a member of the New Jersey Legislative Action Committee, LAC, and in that role, we are taking a look at what, if any, legislation needs to be proposed. We want to be prepared to react to any legislation that might get proposed that would obviously affect, things like inspections and due diligence with regard to high-rise and other types of buildings and the structural integrity, all of this in the unfortunate wake of what happened in Florida. So there's a subcommittee of LAC. I'm chair of that committee. We've asked Mitch to join. We will have another engineer involved, several lawyers. Actually, I have to cull the field down. We have a lot of people interested, but we can't have an enormous committee. And our job and our task will be to coordinate with the chapter board of CAI in New Jersey, follow along with what National is doing, and I think I'll be a little bit involved with Mitch's committee, and then see where we go legislatively. Okay, so if there is something we want to initiate or how we best react to any legislation that might be pending. I'll be on a call with Senator Singleton and George Getrex, who's the chairperson of the LAC committee, Tuesday at 10, I think, to get a sense of where Senator Singleton thinks this might need to go. He must have some interest in this or be getting some input from his constituency and from other senators. So I'll have a little more insight on that on Tuesday, but thank you, Mitch.
Thanks, Ed. And so you can see there's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of statutory stuff that's going on, state level. I don't know about on the federal level. So CAI is taking a very proactive role because I'll be quite honest with you, if you read the articles in the papers, you'll see that most of it is not presented correctly. I was actually interviewed by the Miami NBC affiliate about a week ago. And one of the points I made to them is that a condominium is a form of ownership. It is not a type of building. And the type of situations that we're seeing, as I'll touch on in my presentation, are
Excuse me, would you repeat that last sentence? A condominium is not a what?
Sure, I'm sorry. A condominium is a form of ownership. It is not a type of a building. So,
okay, got it.
It shouldn't be looked at as this is a problem with condos or community associations, because this is an across-the-board infrastructure problem that we're having in this country that is affecting buildings. And as you see, when I go through the presentation, we do a lot of inspections of buildings that are not just condos or community associations. Condos are a type of a community association, but this is an across-the-board problem. And so we'll see how the legislature comes out, but my gut feeling is that that's going to be based on buildings, not just targeting community associations. So with that said, that's background. There's a lot of stuff going on. And as you see, when I go through the presentation, the dust has not settled yet, and the dust is not going to settle for a little while. So I just want to now show you a few things. I mentioned that CAI National has a building inspection public policy task force. And I just wanted to show you what the questions that we're considering on that task force are, because those are the questions I'm going to talk about. Should building inspections of condo buildings be a best practice, mandatory local or state requirements? What should be considered in the building inspections, the age, and I'll touch on this in the presentation, but what should be considered? If it is determined a building inspection should be mandated, what it conduct a SWOT analysis. We're having our first meeting of the task force today, actually, so I'm kind of curious what they mean by a SWOT analysis, but this is the kind of thing for building inspections that's going on at a national level. When it comes to reserve studies, which is another task force that I'm on also, is questions. What changes should be made to the current best practice for condo reserve studies, limited to how is a building maintenance identified, how are major repairs identified, all this kind of stuff. So these are the kind of questions that are going on. And you'll see when I give the presentation that there's a direct connection between reserves and inspections, and that you can't rely on one and the other, which is another problem I see from the press, is it seems to be implying that if a community has a reserve study that's current and funded, that you would not run into these type of problems. And that is totally incorrect. So that's these are some of the public policy things. So the other thing, this presentation assumes that you have a basic knowledge of reserve studies. And I'm pretty sure everybody does. If you have any questions as I'm going along, like I said, please feel free to jump in. What am I talking about? Building basics. What is a structure? What are the materials that are used? What causes deterioration? What is not included in a reserve study? What is maintenance? This question is out there all the time. What is maintenance? What are periodic inspections? And what is the plan? Suggestions for a plan. And to, like Ed said, this plan is something that's evolving, but there's some pretty basic portions of a plan that need to be implemented. It's just a matter from a statutory level and what everybody's going to do about it. But what is a plan with some suggestions? Building basics. And I've put in here on the left a high rise, on the right a low rise. Pretty much the same type of structure. You have columns, you have beams, you have facades, which is the outside of the building. On high rises, you have balconies that stick out generally. On low rises, they're generally decks. Decks are wood, balconies generally are concrete. You have parking garage and high rise. A lot of high rise have parking garages under them and foundations. I will tell you just a little background, forgetting about what's happening. We do a fair amount of inspections on a day-to-day basis. Just in the last month, we have been at least 5 communities that have wood decks that are sticking off of the units that are rotting away and ready to collapse. And we've told them that they have to stop using the decks for safety reasons. So keep in mind, this is all kinds of structures. It's not just high rises. So wood decks are a problem. And for the gentleman who was looking at my Kipcon minutes, I did talk about decks last month because last month was deck month. So now there's a few different materials that buildings are made out of. Steel. Steel, in regards to its strength, it is the same strength in all directions. If you pull it, you push it, you do whatever you do to it, it has the same strength in every direction. And just to give you an idea where the name KIP comes from, it's Kipcon is the name of the company. It has a capacity of, say, 60 KSI, 60 kips per square inch. So that's where Kipcon came from, KIP Consulting, and that's the engineering where the name came from. But steel. Concrete, a little different. Concrete has a very good strength in compression when you push together. It has very little strength when you pull it in tension. So concrete, as you've heard in the news, is made up of concrete and reinforcing steel, or rebar. You hear it from different names. The reinforcing steel is very strong in tension. So that's why it's put into the concrete, although the concrete is very strong in compression. So that's one of the causes of problems with concrete, which we'll touch on, but concrete is made up of 2 materials. And if you, let's look at the bottom left hand very quickly. If you have a beam, when the beam goes into what's called bending, you have compression on the top and tension on the bottom. That's why the reinforcing steel on a beam is generally on the bottom. Very simplified explanation, but that's why concrete is made up of 2 materials, steel and concrete. So that's concrete. Then we have wood. Wood, the strength varies. It's the weakest of the materials, no question about it. Wood is a very interesting material. I've worked a lot on wood design. Wood has a few different strengths. If you're pushing parallel to the grain, it's very strong. But if you push perpendicular to the grain, it's much weaker. So when you're designing in wood, you have to take into account 2 different strengths, parallel to the grain and perpendicular to the grain. The other thing very interesting about wood, if it gets wet, you have a significant loss of strength. Generally, it's about 1/3 of the capacity is lost if it's wet. So think of a wood deck that's in the rain that's absorbing water. The strength goes down significantly. So when you design with wood, you have to take into account an adjustment factor for moisture. Temperature affects the strength. So moisture and temperature affect the strength significantly of wood. But in addition to that, perpendicular to the grain, parallel to the grain. It's very interesting. You could tell I'm a structural engineer and I could talk about this all day. The last
Let me
thing
interrupt with a question, if I may.
Sure, please.
It may not be particularly germane to this, but I've often wondered as I drive by and see buildings or homes under construction in the weather, and there's a lot of wood that is open to the weather for many days while the building is under construction. And I see no effort to cover or protect the exposed wood from, should say, rain, snow, etc. during that process. What does that mean for the long-term strength of the wood in that structure?
That's a great question. And I assume everybody heard it or you jump in, but wood, once it dries, regains its strength. And it takes a long time to absorb a lot of moisture, enough to reduce its strength. For example, I have done, believe it or not, a huge amount of work on wood cooling towers and power plants that are subjected to water 100% of the time. And it's a significant reduction because in that case, it's water and temperature. But once it regains its dryness, so to speak, it regains its strength. So, but good question. But wood is a very interesting material. Now, the other thing is it's not a specific material, but it's a facade, facades of buildings. And I'm only touching on a brick facade, but there are many different types of facade. The facade is the outside walls of a building. And an example of a brick building, it's made up of a system for waterproofing, which includes flashing, weep holes, end dams, and I'm not going to go into what exactly they are, brick ties. This is just one facade type, but we have seen and we're working on many projects right now where you may have a steel lintel on top of a window, like you see here, if you can see my pointer right here, a steel lintel, where because the weep holes aren't there or the flashing isn't there, the lintel gets wet and it rusts. And we're working on a couple of them right now where it's to the point that the lintels have to be replaced. So these are the kind of things that happen. But in this case, a facade is a system. And the system is based on water always gets behind what the outside surface is. How do you get the water out when it gets behind it? So that can get involved with the flashing, the weep holes. We're working on one community right now where I went up and looked at, it's brick, it's about 30 years old. There are no weep holes. And then they're wondering why the lintels are rusting away and they have to replace them all. But that was the original construction. So facades are also a very important part of the building. What's the primary? There's a few causes of deterioration, but in my mind, the number one cause is water. Water causes deterioration, whether it's steel, and I'll show you some examples. These are from actual buildings we're working on. What happens to steel when it gets wet? It rusts. Now, I will tell you, in this case, the pictures I'm showing are not a condominium, are not a community association. This is a parking garage under an office building. And if you look to the left, you can see the steel beam where the bottom of the beam, which is called the web, just has totally rusted through. It is gone. That's from water. On the right, you can see beams and columns that are rusted to the point where they lose their strength. This is what happens to steel when it gets wet. So one of the things I'm going to talk about later is what do you do without being an engineer to identify things? Just walk through your parking garage. Rust, you can see it. You don't need to be an engineer. You need an engineer to figure out how to fix it. But this is what happens to steel when it gets wet. What happens to concrete? I told you concrete is a combination of steel and concrete. One of the primary problems with concrete is that the concrete absorbs moisture. That moisture touches that reinforcing steel, which is steel, and it rusts. What happens when something rusts? It expands and it will crack out or spall. There's a few technical terms, but it will crack out the concrete. When the concrete is gone and the steel rusts, it loses its strength. Here's a couple of examples. To the left, this is looking at what's called a waffle slab ceiling, where the reinforcing has cracked out all of the concrete. It's in the process of being repaired. Next to it is a column. You can see the steel in the corner that is rusted and it's cracked out the corner of the column.
Excuse me?
I'm sorry?
Excuse me?
Yes, Mary?
I don't see any pictures. You're speaking as if we can see pictures.
Can you guys see the presentation?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
I don't know what's wrong.
Oh, Mary, you should be able to see it. I'm sorry.
What I did wrong. Okay, sorry.
I hope everybody else can see it. I
I
was
can see
thinking
the
to myself, I hope
presentation
I'm
as well.
explaining it good if you can't see it. But,
No, you're doing great.
all right. Then on the right-hand side, I included this very, very, very common and scary problem. Balconies on buildings made out of concrete where the bottom steel or the top steel rusts and it pops out the concrete, and you could be 10 stories up and it falls down. And I promise you, it isn't going to feel good if you get hit in the head with a piece of this. It's a very important safety concern with high-rise buildings and concrete balconies. Very important, which I'm going to touch on again later. Now, brick facades. I talked about water and not being flashed right. On the left-hand side, lack of appropriate flashing so that the lintel has rusted, and because it loses its strength, it settles in the middle or deflects, and this is what happens to the brick. On the right-hand side, there are brick ties that hold this to the building to keep the brick from falling off. If you don't have the right number of brick ties or they rust and they're gone, the facade can fall off. In New York, for example, they have local law 11 to inspect facades on a regular basis to make sure that conditions like this are not happening. I will tell you, they're very hard to see too, but these are the kind of things that can happen with brick.
Now, can I ask a question? You showed the brick there on the right side. The complex that I'm in is California stucco on the outside, but it's put up more or less in panels. Would that be the same type of application?
Well, it's a good question. The panels are attached to the building in a similar way, probably, but it's probably a different way that it's flashed. It's a different way that it's supported, but water will get behind it. The question is, how do you get it out? There was a material a number of years ago that it was exterior insulation finish system where they came out with, it's called EFIS, that everybody's pretty familiar with, or maybe familiar with, where it was called a barrier system. Barrier system for the EFIS meant that water can't get through it. It's not supposed to get through it. It just comes down off of it. It created a huge problem because the water was getting behind it. It didn't get out and it destroyed a number of buildings. So now EFIS is a drainable system where the water can drain out. But all of these things conceptually are the same, even though they're different materials. So,
okay.
All right, so now the other thing is we talked about danger. These are just from water. But what happens, how many of you have somebody building something next to your building? Let's say they're driving piles and there are vibrations that affect your building. Let's say they're digging a foundation next to your building, which could affect this foundation that's holding up your building. So there are things other than just water that can affect your building and the strength and that are not from Mother Nature, let's say. But so you also need to pay attention to these type of things. And you'll see a number of the present parts of this I refer to things like this comes from the 2018 New York City Building Safe, Live Safe Conference. So there's a lot of information out there that for reference material, which I'll also touch on in the end. So there's also adjacent construction. This I added this yesterday because I mentioned this is not just for community associations. Yesterday, I got a call from a car wash close to my office and said, somebody said we have a structural problem. Can you come and take a look at it? So I went and looked at it, and let me tell you what I found. It's a car wash in the area where the car wash system is, where the water is pumping away all day. The ceiling is, the roof is held up by steel joists. What they did, if you look at the right picture, and this is just from yesterday afternoon, they put in these tarps hanging from the roof. And I said, why did you put that in there? He said, because some of the rusted steel was falling and we didn't want it to hit the cars below. Then you look on the left and you're not going to believe this. See what I'm circling? This is a steel joist that is gone. It rusted away. I looked at the guy yesterday afternoon and I said, you can't use this car wash anymore. The roof is about to collapse. He said, I had an engineer out here 2 years ago that told me it was all right. So I said, have you done anything in those 2 years? They said, no, we put up the tarps in the ceiling. It's the owner's responsibility. So what I did was I went back to my office. I sent an email and said, it's a structural problem. You have to shut down the building immediately. And I also called the local building department because I said to the guy, if something happens tomorrow and I was here and didn't do anything, I'm part of the lawsuit. I called the building department in the town and I told him, I didn't tell him which building. He said, it must be the car wash because we were out there a month ago. We fined them and said, you had to fix it immediately and they haven't done anything. We're going to go out there tomorrow and shut it down. This happened yesterday afternoon. And the point I want to make is it's every kind of building. You have to pay attention to your buildings. because this is what does happen. Not can happen, this is what does happen. Look at the picture, the joist is gone. All right, now I want to touch on reserve studies for a few minutes. There's a misimpression out there in the world that if you have a reserve study that is funded, that these type of problems will not happen. Now, I want to explain to you first of all, a reserve study is a budget planning tool. It is not an engineering inspection of your building. Two completely different things. In order to be a reserve specialist and get the designation from CAI, there's an RS designation. It does not require an engineering degree. And at least 50% of the people in the world that do reserve studies are not engineers. The requirements are on the right, prerequisites, a college bachelor level degree, but it's one of these four, one of the following. Only one of them is an engineering degree. You do not have to have an engineering degree to do a reserve study. A reserve study is not an engineering study. It is a budgetary planning tool. So do not ever think that because you have a reserve study done for your building, that's going to protect you against problems in your building of structural of nature. So reserve studies, my biggest fear, and I've said it a number of times in these task forces, is that the press is going to come out and they're leading this in the direction that the way to solve the problem is an adequately funded reserve study. It's not true. I promise you a reserve study does not include the structure of a building. That's not a cyclical replacement. If you have to replace the structure, something went wrong, which I'm going to talk about. So reserve study is not an engineering study. Remember that. What is not included in the reserve study? The common elements that are included in a reserve study, there's a 4-part test, which is to the right here. And I can send you a copy of the National Reserve Study Standards if you like. But it's based on cyclical replacements, a roof every 20 years, a parking, a road every 20 years, but it's based on things that on a cycle need to be replaced. And there's a 30-year concept that is critical for you with reserve studies. Reserve studies are typically including cyclical replacements that will take place within 30 years after you do the study. So if you're getting an update of your study done, you have to make sure that the company that's doing it, if the community is now 10 years old, you're going out for 40-year components. Things will have to be added to your study. We recommend that when people do updates, if the community is more than even 5 years old, you have to look at the entire community to see if things should be added. So this 30-year concept is very important. And then maintenance, which I'm going to talk about, which is part of the plan, and it's not included in a reserve study. Some people look at a reserve study and say, why doesn't it include maintenance? It's not a cyclical replacement. It's not a capital replacement, but there are certain things on there that fall into what I call a gray area that some people consider maintenance. For example, if you include pavement seal coating in a reserve study, which we generally do, somebody consider that to be maybe maintenance. If you include parking garage deck sealant or balcony sealant, some people consider that maintenance. But my point is, there's no, I hate to say, there's really no strict guideline. That should be included in the reserve study or in a maintenance schedule. And there's one company that I know of, and the person from that company spoke a little while ago, not that I want to pick out anybody, and they will not accept somebody doing a reserve study for any of their communities unless they do a maintenance schedule along with it because of the connection between the two. So I'll touch on that a little more. And CAI also came out with a paper recently.
Wait, excuse me, can I interrupt 1 second? Can
Please.
you center that? Because I'm only getting half of what you're showing on the screen. Is there a way to fix that?
I think everybody's, are you guys seeing the whole screen?
Yes.
I think everybody's seeing it. I'm sorry.
I see the whole screen.
No, I don't see the whole screen.
If you're on a small screen, you just have to swipe to the right or left to see the rest of it.
No, I did that. It's not moving.
Oh, I'm sorry. What we're going to do is we'll send everybody a copy of this PowerPoint when we're done. So
okay, I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Sorry, there's not much.
Yeah, you just have to adjust your view to look at on the side, and then to the left would be the document.
No, I tried that. It's not doing it, and I don't want to do anything else. But continue. Sorry,
we'll send you a copy. We'll send you a copy.
Thank you.
All right. CAI just recently came out with a publication called Aging Infrastructure Report, which I'd be happy to send you all a copy of also. Keep in mind, if you go to the CAI national website, most of the stuff I'm showing you is free. Just go there, you can download them as PDF files. But this was about aging infrastructure, came out about a year ago, and it's specifically related essentially to the type of stuff we're talking about. And you'll see that there was a survey done. And what the questions were asked of people that responded to the survey is how to plan and execute reserve studies, how to evaluate and hire qualified engineers, architects, and contractors, and how to implement comprehensive inspection and maintenance programs. That came out about a year ago, and this is exactly what we're talking about today. And what I think, and as Ed mentioned, is there's probably going to be more and more statutory requirements that you have to do this. It's not optional. But this came out in this infrastructure report, and again, I'd be happy to send that to you. Also, reserve studies. You're going to see a lot of statutory requirements more and more in play in favor of having to do reserve studies. But I want to tell you where we are now. Right now, there are 9 states that require that reserve studies be done by condominiums. Here's the list of the 9 states: California, Colorado, that's the list. But it's kind of interesting. There are 11 states that require reserve funding. Now, what does that mean? It means some states require reserve studies be done, but they don't require that you fund the reserve studies. But there's 11 states that require funding, but all of the states that require reserve studies don't necessarily require that you fund them. I mean, for example, if you look at the list, it's kind of interesting. I compared them, but just so you know what's going on out there, for those of you from New Jersey right now has no statutory requirements for community associations to do reserve studies. So they don't have statutory requirements, but when a developer plans a condominium in New Jersey, they are required as part of their public offering statement budget to include adequate reserves. So I just want to comment on New Jersey because I actually didn't realize we're going to have some people from Washington and stuff here. But if you want, I have a paper that was just that I can send all of you that lists every state and what the requirements are for reserve studies. That's going to be changing big time because of what's happened, I'm sure. And but that's where we are right now with reserve studies. Current reserve study, other regulations. Right now from the banking industry, it used to be that only a small amount of mortgage companies for refinance and purchasing had certain requirements in terms of reserves. Right now, the numbers estimate to be a range of 60% of all US condo associations now have banks that require certain things. The thing that is generally required as part of these definitions is that they are funding 10% of their budget as reserves, or they have a reserve study that's 24 months or so old. So there are certain requirements out there from the lending perspective. I think you may see from this arena requirements for lending, not only based on reserves, but maybe based on inspections also. So there's other things going on that require reserve studies. This is the current CAI reserve study public policy, which is going to change. It says the policy is currently under review, which is what one of these task forces is doing. The policy is moving towards mandatory reserve study requirements for condos and community associations with major components. Now, I look at this and say, that's great for business, I guess, but what the heck is a major component? How do you define it? But this is the kind of stuff that on a national level is being discussed to come up with a public policy on this. Also, I wanted to show you, this is an industry data thing that CAI recently did. And it says, just to give you a couple examples, if you live in a condo or homeowner association, does your community have a reserve study? 60% yes. Does your community have a fund to plan the repair and replacing the major components owned? Yes, 75%. So there's kind of a little bit of a disconnect. They have a plan to fund it, but 75%, but 60% of them are reserve studies. So some people are funding it without having a reserve study. So I don't know how they come up with the amount. And then do you support annual investing of your community to build fund for future repair and replacement? 71%. So just some basic background information I wanted to share with you. All right, now very important, maintenance. People think that maintenance, there's only one type of maintenance, and maintenance is maintenance is maintenance. What do you mean by maintenance? It's the work of keeping something in proper condition, care or upkeep, including taking steps to avoid something breaking down, preventive maintenance, and bringing something back to working order, corrective maintenance. Two different kinds of maintenance, but I put in here a few different definitions. Routine maintenance means you come in and vacuum every day, you change a light bulb, whatever, that kind of thing, day-to-day stuff. Preventive maintenance is maintenance carried out at predetermined intervals. Say you have one of your common elements that, let's say a fence, a wood fence. Maintenance may be painted every 5 years or stained every 5 years. Preventive maintenance. These type of things or items are such things as pavement seal coating, parking garage and balcony coatings, which may be included in the reserve study, preventive maintenance. But again, I'll mention, it's very rare that a community will have a reserve study and a preventive maintenance study done at the same time. But there's definite connection, as you can see, because in my mind, the concept of preventive maintenance is if the things on your reserve study have an estimated useful life, you have to maintain them to attain that useful life. And a common one I will mention is wood siding. How many times have we worked for an association that we look at it and the wood siding has never been maintained, it's starting to fall apart, and now it should be added to the reserve study because it has not been maintained. And if anybody has any comments, Ed, you look like you're chomping at the bit to say something about this, so feel free to jump in if you do. But preventive maintenance. The other one, which is the biggest concern, very big concern, is corrective maintenance. Corrective maintenance means you detect a problem and you fix it. That's corrective maintenance. Corrective maintenance is something that you cannot plan for. A lot of times corrective maintenance is needed because you don't do preventive maintenance. But corrective maintenance ties directly into what I'm going to talk about in terms of periodic inspections. But corrective maintenance is to correct something. So you go into your parking garage and you see rust coming out of the concrete, you correct it. A year before that, you may not have seen it. So corrective maintenance is very, very important. But my point is there's a few different types of maintenance. They're not all lumped into one thing. All right, periodic inspections, the other leg of the stool. A periodic inspection is an inspection aimed at identifying issues when they become evident so that you can do corrective maintenance. Keep in mind, deterioration of a building is a progressive thing. It doesn't happen all at once. It can occur, a building can occur over time. It doesn't can occur over time. I got to change that wording. Deterioration of a building does occur over time, and wear and tear, due to deterioration, wear and tear, poor maintenance, it is a progressive condition which worsens over time. Not typically. I've never seen it get better, and I've never seen it stop getting worse. And the type of periodic inspections that you're hearing more and more about are not part of the reserve study physical analysis. A periodic inspection needs to be done by somebody who understands structure. Like I said before, and that's why I mentioned what the qualifications of somebody doing a reserve study is, because they are not in many instances trained to do these type of periodic inspections. There are many things, recommendations in terms of what the frequency of periodic inspections are. This is something that is being beat up, and Ed mentioned that that's what the New Jersey Task Force is doing. That's what the local task, the national task force is doing. But I'm going to show you some examples. This is not reinventing the wheel. I'm going to show you what I mean by that. But periodic inspections timing is based on many different things. The age of the building, the use of the building. For example, if you have a parking garage in a building, you should inspect it more frequently than not a parking garage, because it's subjected to the elements. It's subjected in the winter in our part of the country to people driving in it and bringing in the salt from the roads. So certain types of buildings and portions of buildings need periodic inspections more frequently. Periodic inspections based on the condition of the building, the geographic location. No question that although the type of problems we're talking about are common to all buildings, if you have a building that's on the ocean, that's subjected to salt water 24/7, 365 days a year, there's absolutely a chance that it's going to deteriorate more quickly. So that timing is based on geography. And one of the things I'm going to talk about, if an assessment is not made, which most buildings do not have an assessment made yet in most instances, the first assessment is generally called a baseline assessment. And I'll talk about it in a second, but you need a baseline assessment as a starting point to determine what type of periodic inspection frequency you should have. Periodic inspections typically come into two categories. Preliminary assessment, where you go out and you visually observe it. Can you see rust? Can you see water? Can you see different things and identify it? And the preliminary assessment includes a review of the original structural drawings, looking at any previous reports, any issues that are going on, and things like that. But it's to evaluate based on a kind of a cursory nature, the potential for problems. Potential for problem can include, you see a ceiling that is damaged.
I have my things in my ear, so I'm listening.
You see
what?
You see a ceiling that is damaged by water.
Sorry.
What do? What which I'll touch on later, and I touch on this a few times because it's important. You stop the water and you check to see if any damage was caused by that water. But the first stage is generally a periodic inspection as a preliminary. This then issues a report and may recommend a detailed assessment, which gets involved with material testing, invasive evaluation, structural design, preparation of specifications for repair. Once you do a preliminary evaluation, it could, in most cases, narrows you down to certain parts of the building to do a detailed assessment. It may not be the entire building. For example, if you go out, everything looks great, except the concrete balconies are starting to show signs of rust and spalling and things like that. The detailed assessment then may be targeted on that certain part, but generally 2 types of inspections. So what about the frequency? Should it be 5 years, 10 years, 40 years? It's based on building type, building age. Keep in mind, you may need to do a building inspection a period based on an emergency. Let's say somebody's building something next door and they're vibrating your building and you start seeing cracking, it may be an emergency. Or let's say a car comes in and crashes into a column. So what is the frequency? So I want to point out a few things that are going on right now. Jersey City mulls stricter building inspection after Surfside collapse. Now they're saying concrete residential and commercial buildings that rise 6 stories or more would need visual structural inspections every 10 years. I took this out of yesterday's newspaper, or maybe it was from a few days ago. But these are the kind of things that are gurgling around. Although I would make the argument that just putting a 10-year time frame on that, in my mind, should have a starting point. Once you inspect it and see the conditions, if everything's okay, 10 years. If you see bad stuff, maybe every 2 years. But these are the kind of things. That's in Jersey City. Here, this is for New York. 3 New York senators are pushing for stiffer building inspection requirements following the deadly collapse in Florida. And so they didn't say in this article what they're recommending, but this is going on. Now, in Florida, clearly, Palm Beach County plans to ratchet up inspection for older high-rise and these kind of things. So you're reading about this in the paper every day. It's happening as there are articles being written about this stuff as we're sitting here. All right, so what is the plan? The plan is that there are 3 legs holding up the building. There's the reserve study, there's preventive maintenance, and the periodic inspections, which in my mind will give you a safe building. So what does that mean? Establish your baseline. As far as suggestion, establish a baseline for your building. The baseline is an inspection report to look at it to see today's condition and do a report. That in baseline report, which is essentially the preliminary report I talked about a few minutes ago, will then give you a basis. Do I need to do anything immediately? Can I prioritize things? But establish the baseline for your building. The baseline evaluation, a good starting point for community associations. Use your reserve study as a starting point, but that is not the answer. It's just a starting point. Evaluate all the common elements. Include those that are not in the reserve study. For example, the columns in the parking garage are not in the reserve study. The ceiling and beams in the parking garage are not in the reserve study, but you should be looking at them as part of this baseline study. I'm just suggesting a reserve study is a good starting point, but think about it. Just because you may want to consider updating your reserve study when this is done, but the qualifications of the person doing the reserve update are not necessarily, in many, many cases, the same qualifications as the person who can do this kind of evaluation. So do not connect them. It's just a thought, but do not connect them. It's a different type of qualification. Establish a maintenance plan for both preventive and corrective. The corrective maintenance will come out of this study. What do you need to correct right away? I promise you, if you start corrective maintenance on things that are starting to break down, it's a lot cheaper to do it now than to do it later. A very common problem I see in parking garages, if you have parking garages in your building, is that there's what's called an expansion joint for 2 sections of the parking garage. And underneath it is structural steel. The expansion joint breaks and water's getting through. Replace the expansion joint as soon as the water goes through and it'll be a few $1,000s. But I can show you pictures of structural steel underneath it that is going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to fix because they did not fix the expansion joint. So when you see something, stop the water. Establish the maintenance plan, preventive corrective. Establish a periodic inspection schedule. This is based on the results of this baseline study. Depending on the condition, what's found, then you can establish your periodic inspection schedule. Consider an operating manual. The reason I put this in here, I've given this example many times. When you buy a car, what do? You look in the glove compartment and what's there. There's an operating manual to tell you how to operate and maintain your car. When you move into a community, what do you get to tell you to maintain and how to operate the community? You get the public offering statement. First of all, the public offering statement doesn't tell you this, the governing documents. And second of all, you're not going to read it anyway. So, you know, some builders and some, forget, not even builders, communities should consider maybe putting together an operating manual for their community. So I think some of these things you're going to start seeing to happen, because the operating manual may say periodic inspection every 2 years. It's not going to tell you exactly what to do, but it's going to put you on a schedule to do things so you know what to do as it happens. So an operating manual. Again, pay special attention to any type of exposed structure, whether it's concrete, steel, wood, or whatever. You can see the problems. You don't need to be an engineer. If you see water, you see rust, you see staining, it's a problem. You need to take the next step. The places to look are exposed structure, facade. We just finished a reserve study yesterday. And when my guy was out there doing the reserve study, it was a brick building, and we saw locations where there was efflorescence occurring. Efflorescence on a brick facade means you're seeing a white, salty-like material on the facade. What that means is that water is going from the inside to the outside and carrying the salts in the cement to the outside, putting a salty fixture on the outside of the facade, whether it's brick or concrete. What does that mean? It means that water is traveling from the inside to the outside. And I'm going to show you a picture in a couple of seconds, but when you see the salts, that means the water is moving. Next thing you're going to see is rust stains. So there are things that you can look at that identify problems. Parking garage, big problems. Got to look at them. And a lot of times, I hate to say it, and I'm not referring to Florida, I'm just referring in general. The parking garages are underneath the buildings. They're holding up the buildings. I'm not saying that to scare you. That's just how a lot of these places are. Concrete balconies, I mentioned that. Wood decks. Wood decks are a huge problem. It's not just high rises. Any signs of moisture, if you're a manager or a board member or whoever, and you see any sign of moisture, stop it and figure out if it caused any damage. And for all the identified concerns, you know, you can prioritize them based on this type of study. But the most important word is to act. You have to do something, because it's not going to get better. It's progressive. So here, I wanted to show you this picture. It's a great picture. It's from a building I was at a few weeks ago. It's concrete column. And here's what's happening. There's a crack where the water's coming through. This shows both stages. To the left, that white salty-like material is efflorescence. It shows that water is going through the concrete. On the right next to it, that water has been touching the reinforcing steel and you're getting rust. So this is a great picture, because generally you see the efflorescence first, and then whenever in the future you see the rusting. But this shows exactly what happens. If you see the efflorescence, do something. If you see the rust stains, you have to do something, because as soon as you see the rust stains, that means that the reinforcing steel inside the concrete is rusting, expanding, and the next thing is the concrete's going to pop off of that and the strength is going away. So concrete, look for cracking, look for efflorescence, look for rust. Steel, look for rust, pretty straightforward. The other thing I mentioned about steel is, if you're going to a parking garage, a lot of times in your parking garages, the steel is covered with fireproofing insulation. It's like a white stuff that covers the steel, but it doesn't hide the rust. You can see that insulation, the brown stuff on it. So that needs to act. I mean, I could show you millions of pictures, because this happens every day of the week. Wood, look for rotted wood. You can see rotted wood. I look at these decks, and they, you know, some of the things I see recently all the time is crazy. All right, if you see signs of water, stop it, fix it if there's any damage. And the reason I show you this picture on the right is because this is a parking garage we're working on right now, where you can see encased in the concrete is structural steel. It's a column, but we saw rusting stains on the concrete. So if you see signs of water, stop it, find out if there is damage. So we said, we need to take this off to see what's going on. Where's this rust coming from? So we took it off, and we found that the base plate and the steel column is rusting. And what we had to do is we had to remove the concrete going up and down into where the rust stopped. And we found that the rust was significant enough in this area that we have to structurally reinforce this column. And the only reason we found it was because we saw the rust stains, and we said we have to take it apart to not only stop the water, but to fix what's underneath it. So in this case, we actually are in the process of welding steel plates onto this column to give it additional strength and we found it because of the rust signs. You can see it. It's totally encased in concrete up and down the column and at the bottom, but we saw the rust. So what not to do as a manager or a board member. This is not uncommon. This is a parking garage that we just finished the specification for repair of. And we walked into the parking garage, and what do you see? You see a blue tarp on the ceiling. Now, Ed, I saw you smile because you've seen this before. You see a blue tarp on the ceiling. Why do they put that in there? They put it in there because water is dripping through, and they don't want the water to drip on the cars. So they put in a tarp. I've seen gutters and downspouts put into parking garages to do this, where they put in this tarp to direct the water away so that it doesn't drip on the cars. But what does it do? They don't even look to see the structural damage. And now you can't see the structural damage is continuing to get worse and worse. So when we did the specification for this, we said the first thing you have to do is pull down all the tarps. Now you can see here, you can see the rust that's going on, but this is just the edge. But this is a no-no. Never, ever say, put in something to get the water away from our cars or dripping on people, because things are getting worse behind it. But what not to do as a manager or board member, not only know what not to do, but this gives you an idea. You walk through a parking garage, most of these things as lay people, not as engineers, you can see the problems. You may need an engineer to come up with what's the extent of it and how to fix it. But a lot of these things you can see on your own. Just open your eyes. So now, what do you do if you need money for emergency work? Now, I just want to touch on this quickly because money, I don't necessarily agree with this, but sometimes you need money instantly to do stuff. Now, if you take a look at your reserve study, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, and I don't really agree with this, but sometimes only if you pay yourself back, but there's full funding, baseline funding. Baseline funding goes down to zero, as you can see here. Full funding is way up here. The concept is if you need money in an absolute emergency, and you still want to make sure you're funding okay, maybe pull money out to reduce your beginning balance to the point where you're baseline funding instead of full funding. In this case, I think I'll give you an example. In this case, the beginning balance was $2.5 million. And to go from full funding to baseline funding, they were able to take out, if they wanted to, $1,950,000 in an emergency, absolute emergency. Again, I don't recommend this. You shouldn't get to this point. But sometimes if you need to fix something, a building's going to fall and you need money instantly, you may want to consider this. So they are able in this case to take out $1,950,000 and still not go below zero. So source of money, but keep in mind, you have to pay it back. If you take money out of your fund, if you go to baseline funding, take my word for it, it's underfunding. You're very, very risky, very, very risky. But sometimes in an absolute emergency, I only mention this, even though I don't agree with it, because just so you're aware that there is money in an absolute emergency. Now, what else to evaluate? Prioritize, if you need money, look at your reserve study, prioritize your replacements. If you push things back a couple of years, it's going to maybe change amount you need to set aside, adjust useful lives, review double funding, do not take maintenance out of your budget, but just things in emergency, there's possibly money out there. Now, I just want to show you a couple of great references. I've done a bunch of research on this in the last few weeks for obvious reasons, and there is some great stuff out there. For example, this is from Ontario, Canada. It's a booklet called Structural Condition Assessments of Existing Buildings and Designated Structure Guidelines. Very interesting because this talks about types of building. Everything we've talked about is in this book. And if anybody would like a copy, I'd be happy to tell you where I got it from or give you a PDF copy. The one thing that's really not in here is suggested guidelines for periodic inspections, but they do talk about what I talk about is establishing a baseline report, preliminary evaluation to set up what periodic inspections could be. This is from Singapore. It's awesome. Singapore, they have something, safe structures and safe buildings, periodic structural inspections, where if you look at this, it goes, role of the professional engineer, examples of structural defects found in buildings. It's awesome. This is what they do in Singapore. This is the second page. I had to show it because here it says, for residential, 10-year residential inspections, 5 years for others. I don't understand the logic behind that, to be quite honest with you, because as I said before, the use of the building does not dictate how quickly it's going to deteriorate. other than maybe a parking garage. But if it's residential or commercial office building, the exact same building, why 10 years for one and 5 years for the other? But that's another thing. But there's huge amount of reference information out there. This is something, condo safety, this is put out by CAI. They just came out with this. If you go to the website, there's a number of links to stuff there, condo safety, structural integrity, maintenance, and reserves. This is a work in progress, as I mentioned before, but that's out there. This New York City has a great amount of information. This is facade conditions, an illustrated glossary. If you look at this, it's about a 40 or 50 page book with pictures of every type of condition you can find on any type of building for every type of material. It's a great reference source, facade conditions, an illustrated glossary. This is American Society of Civil Engineers has guideline for structural condition assessments of existing buildings. American Concrete Institute has strength evaluation of existing concrete buildings. American Concrete Institute has guide for conducting visual inspections of concrete in service. This is the aging in place book that I mentioned that CAI has about infrastructures. And that's all the information. You know, this is a webinar I did where I had no idea how long it was going to last or how short or long. So I wasn't really sure, but it's pretty much almost exactly an hour. So this is all the information. It's a work in progress. I'd be happy to share any of this information. If you have any particular questions, feel free to email me. But this brings you up to date on everything. I will say that this is an infrastructure problem across the country. How many times have you pulled up to a red light under a bridge and you look at the concrete column and you see the reinforcing steel showing because the concrete has chipped off and you see rusting reinforcing steel and you say, I can't wait for that light to turn green. It happens to me all the time. I know one particular spot in Weehawken when I go to visit my son, and it's happening everywhere. It's not just community associations. And look what's happened on the federal level with infrastructure. What is it, 3.5 billion, whatever it is. But it's not just community associations. And if we don't do something, these conditions are continue to get worse. They're not going to get better. It's progressive. So does anybody have any questions? If you do, please feel free to jump in. And like this presentation was recording if you find it to be useful. But any questions or comments from anybody? Comments would be great because this is, as you can say, real-time stuff, and any suggestions or thoughts you have for everybody, please share it. And you may want to consider looking into that high-rise course that CAI is giving the end of July. But any questions, comments, anything?
This has been very interesting. I live in a condominium complex. It's only 80 units. Each address has a simplex and a duplex is above, and we have water. I mean, unbelievable amount of water. And this has been very informative.
Thank you very much. Let me tell you what happened to me last week. We were hired by a community above. It's a mid to high-rise building to do a reserve study. So the board sends us an inspection report.
Mitch?
Yes. I'm sorry?
I'm sorry.
No, the board sent us some.
Go ahead.
One of the things they do is they give us information. They sent us an inspection report for a year ago that said there's spalling of the concrete balconies. You need to add temporary support today because it's a safety issue. This is a year later. I said, what have you done? They said nothing. And they sent me this report as backup for a reserve study. It's craziness, some of this stuff. So, and let me look at, I'm going down here, a couple questions. Is a physical condition study an engineering study? Yes, it should be done by somebody who's an engineer who's familiar with what to look at. All right, let's see. Do reserve studies include subsurface utilities such as sanitary and storm sewer? Generally, they do not. The logic behind that is that the sanitary pipes and the storm sewers, first, you should never have to replace all of them. So they're generally not included. Then the question goes, if your community is 40 years old, now you're going out 30 years from there. So maybe they fall within that 70-year window that I was talking about before. One of the things we like to do is ask for ongoing problems you've been having for your community. Let's say you're paying $10,000 a year to replace storm sewers. We may suggest that a line item be put in the reserve site for $10,000 a year to cover that type of thing, but it varies by community, but generally it's not included. Be aware of potential tax cuts. Ken Bloom, my buddy, you're here. Ken is from Boston. He's an accountant, I know, through CAI. Be aware of potential tax consequences of borrowing from reserves. Great point. Unfortunately, sometimes in an emergency, you got to pay tax or whatever, but it's a great point. Ken, you want to put up your email address so people can contact you for information, but contact your accountant about what implications you may have. But How many people have heard of borrowing from the reserves because you don't have enough money for snow plowing? If you could borrow from your reserves from snow plowing, I promise you, you should borrow from your reserves to fix a structural problem when a beam's going to collapse. This has been an excellent. Okay, please confirm that it was yes, we will. Okay, let's see. I've rust coming through one of my community sidewalks. Well, it depends where the sidewalk is. I mean, if it's a sidewalk at ground level and you're having rust coming through it, it's sitting on the ground, so it's not going to go anywhere. So it really depends on where it is. We will send a PDF. Great, let's see anything else. How do we attain your references? Oh, for each of these articles, well, how about if I do this? I actually have a piece of paper, a Word document that I've put links to all these documents. We'll send you a copy of that. And if you just touch on the links, you can get all these documents. There's a huge amount of information out there, which I'm sure is part of this CAI national and local task force. We're going to be gathering all kinds of information to use as references for where we're going. And if I can suggest maybe, or one thought I have is that maybe in 3 or 4 months, or maybe even sooner than that, we do a repeat presentation of what's happened and where we're going, rather than, you know, this is a work in action. This is just real-time stuff right now. Any other comments, questions? There's a lots to take in. You want me to start over again? Yeah, we'll provide a link. We'll provide a link to the presentation, and so you can watch it over and over again if you like, after you watch my comedy routines. Any other questions, thoughts?
Hey, Mitch, I have one, I guess. Oh, I'm sorry, I'll defer. Go ahead.
Yeah, I had written this in the chat. The physical condition, you keep talking about reserve study and that it's not an engineering study. But would a physical condition study be considered an engineering study?
Absolutely, yes. I thought I'd answer. Yeah, a physical condition.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it needs somebody who understands structures and buildings to do that. Reserve study people do not need to be engineers. For example, if we go out to look at a wood deck, we're going out to look at the wood deck to see how many years life does it have left based on its condition. But we're not looking at it to see, is it connected correctly to the building, on the handrail post connected properly. We're doing it based on age and condition. Don't get me wrong, that if a person doing a reserve study, this question came up a lot at a committee meeting, if a person is doing a reserve study sees damage or something, we have to now add in what we call a supplementary information section to our reserve study if we happen to see something, but we're not inspecting everything. We're not looking to see if it's built right, if it's attached right. We're looking at it primarily for how much life does it have left. And I'll tell you, crazy stuff's going on in this industry. We were called into an association that have wood decks, first and second floor. I'm not going to mention any names. One of the first floor decks that's 2 feet above the ground collapsed. Okay, so we went up and looked at it. The decks there are 40 years old. The reserve study that they had done 3 years ago, the board specifically requested that the decks be taken off of the reserve study because they were going to maintain them as they go, and they didn't want them on the reserve study. They're not there anymore. So it's the same design for the upper and the lower. So they asked us to go out and do a comprehensive report. We evaluated them all. We said they're not safe. So they said, can you give us a spec to do the lower level decks? So I said, what about the upper level decks? They said, well, the lower level decks, we can get into the crawl spaces to attach them properly, but the upper level decks, we'd have to remove ceilings possibly to do that, and we don't want to do it. So I said, well, the upper level decks, if they fall, they're going down 15 feet. If the lower level decks fall, they're going 3 feet. So they've changed their mind, but they're very concerned about prioritizing what should be done and not doing it all at once. So this is the kind of stuff that we run into. And we've pretty much taken a pretty hard position on this stuff, that if it's a safety issue, you got to fix it. I mean, so any other comments?
Mitch, I have a question.
Oh, sorry.
That's quite all right. With regard to basements, you know, many high-rise buildings have maybe multiple stories of basements, underground structures. How do you, from a visual inspection standpoint, maybe identify, or can you identify what might be a problem subterranean to the last, you know, level of the floor or the columns in the basement that might be a telltale sign of something going on with the footings, the pilings, or what's under the building?
I would say movement or efflorescence. You know, if you see any signs of water, check it out. If you start seeing the slab getting a lot of cracks, check it out. If the walls, you see cracks in walls all the time, but if you start seeing them move, so they're either in, to move in. If you start seeing moving, it's a sign, movement.
Thank you.
Anything else? All right, there was something else I was going to say, but I forget what it is. So I'm getting older. Well, let's see.
Let me simply say, Mitch, this was an excellent presentation, akin to a fire hose of information. But I'm really grateful to you, and I look forward to receiving the PowerPoint. This is Sam Wyman.
Thank you very much. Thank
Outstanding, Mitch. Thank you.
Excellent job as always, Mitch.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. All right, and we will have a recording of this. We'll send you all a link of it. Jolie from my office, who takes care of that, is listening. Thank you very much, everybody. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. But my closing comment is, you have to do something. I mean, I'm not saying it to scare you, but your buildings are not getting younger. The problems are progressive, and the longer you wait, the more it's going to cost. And hopefully nobody will get hurt if you do wait. So you got to look at your buildings. This is kind of a wake-up call. So
I just want to make sure I get your Word Perfect, your Word document with all the attachments to it. So
yeah, no problem. I'm gonna send that. I'm gonna send the list, a copy of the PowerPoint, and the link to the presentation.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day. It's pretty much perfect. 10:30.
Thank you, Mitch.
Thanks,
great as always.
Thanks, Mitch. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too, everybody. Take care.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I thought that was excellent.
Yep.